CMP and welcome to the CMP class. Before we start with our class today, I would love you to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Follow this channel for more videos. In the last class, we looked at the definition of intestinal obstruction. Now, before we go to the causes of intestinal obstruction, I would love you to understand that intestinal obstruction is an emergency, and therefore the diagnosis of intestinal obstruction should be very sharp, and it should be done in a proper way, because if proper diagnosis is not done, there is likely to be a lot of complications that may come. And it is also important to know that intestinal obstruction can be divided into two categories. We have complete intestinal obstruction and we have incomplete intestinal obstruction. What is complete intestinal obstruction and what is incomplete intestinal obstruction? In complete intestinal obstruction, there is total obstruction of the flow of intestinal contents, meaning nothing flows through the point of obstruction. In incomplete intestinal obstruction, there is partial obstruction of the flow of the intestinal contents. This means that a few things, especially fluids, are able to pass through, but other things are not able to pass through. All right. Now, I would want us to go on and look at the causes of intestinal obstruction. Now, intestinal obstruction causes have been classified into two classes. We have what we call functional causes as well as mechanical causes. So number one, functional causes. Number two, mechanical causes. So we will look at functional causes of intestinal obstruction. Then we will also look at mechanical causes of intestinal obstruction. Functional causes. When we say functional causes, what do we mean? When we have functional intestinal obstruction, now when we say functional causes, it means there is what we call functional intestinal obstruction. So functional intestinal obstruction is a type of intestinal obstruction where the flow of intestinal contents is impeded or prevented or obstructed. The biggest problem in functional intestinal obstruction is not that there is something in the way or in the lumen that is preventing the flow. No. The issue is that the intestines are failing to function well. Now, one of the functions of the intestines is to propel food in a wave-like movement, which we call peristalsis. So the intestines are supposed to push the food in this wave-like movement from the small intestines to the big intestines, from the big intestines or the large intestines into the rectum. Then from the rectum, the contents can be taken outside. What causes the intestines to push food in a peristaltic movement? When you go to your anatomy and physiology of the GIT or the digestive system. If this is an intestine, the opening there is going to be called the lumen. Then this is the wall. Chibumba. This is the wall of the intestine. Now, when you look at this wall is made up of 4 layers. The innermost layer is called mucosa, then followed by another layer called submucosa, then followed by another layer called muscularis or muscle layer. Then we have the 4th layer, which is on the outside, which we call serosa. Okay, now I'm interested in the muscle layer. This muscle layer of the wall of the intestine, just like I've said, muscle layer, has the ability to contract and relax. Now, as these muscles contract and relax, they help food to move from one portion of the intestine to another in a wave-like movement called peristalsis. Okay, but if the muscles of the walls of the intestines are unable to properly contract, then there is a problem in the function of these intestines. And if there is a problem in this function, we are likely to have what we call functional intestinal obstruction. So functional intestinal obstruction is coming because the intestine cannot function. And what function are we looking at? We are looking at the function of propelling the food or pushing the food in a wave-like movement. The intestine will not do this because there is a problem with the muscles. Now, what is this which we are looking at? How is it that the muscles are not working as they are supposed to work? So there are different things that can lead to muscles failing to work. There is what we call myopathy. Now, myopathy can come due to different kinds of things. Now, myopathy is a disease of the muscles, and this will cause the muscles to become very weak. And when the muscles are weak, they cannot contract, and this will mean that food will not be pushed. So in myopathy, there is likely to be intestinal obstruction. Now, myopathy can come when you need to understand that for muscles to contract, they need, muscles are made up of proteins, and inside the muscles there is mitochondria and other elements that cause the muscles to contract well. So if there is deficiency in these things, muscles may not be able to contract well. If there is a problem in oxygen supply to the muscles, muscles will become weak and they will not be able to contract as they should. If there is no proper, supply of glucose to the muscles will be weak. So all these, if the muscles miss the important nutrients which are needed and other elements, the muscles may become weak. And when they become weak, they will not be able to contract properly to push food. Now, when we talk about functional intestinal obstruction, one of the things that we'll never miss is what we call paralytic ileus, or let me say ileus. Now, what is ileus? Ileus refers to the paralysis of the muscles. Now, here we are talking about the muscles of the small intestines. So when there is paralytic ileus, or when there is ileus, these muscles are going to be in a state of paralysis, which can either be a partial or total paralysis. Okay, so if the muscles are paralyzed, then they can't push food. So if the muscles are paralyzed, then we call that as paralytic ileus. Now, paralytic ileus usually will come due to what we call neuropathy, a problem in the neurons that supply the muscles of the intestines. Now, there are neurons or a network of neurons that supply the intestines, which we call the Auerbach plexus. If there is a problem in the development of the Auerbach's plexus, this will mean that when a child is born, the muscles of the intestines are not going to be contracting as they should, and this will lead to intestinal obstruction. That is why when you look at functional intestinal obstruction is mostly associated with children. It is seen so much in children. And in which children? Those children with what we call developmental defects of the Auerbach's plexus. So when there is a problem in the development of the Auerbach's plexus, then the child is likely to have what we are calling intestinal obstruction, specifically functional intestinal obstruction. I hope that is clear. If it is not clear, you can ask me questions in the comments below and I'll be able to attend to those questions. So that is it about functional intestinal obstruction. But maybe let me mention this. You will find also functional intestinal obstruction in people who have problems with kidneys. Kidney disease may predispose someone to paralytic ileus. Why? Because when someone has kidney disease, the kidneys are not likely to be filtering the blood very well. So the blood will be full of impurities, and one of the waste products that will build up in the blood is what we call urea. And urea will affect the contraction of muscles. So because of too much urea in the blood, and this blood is being supplied everywhere, so when this blood reaches to the muscles of the intestines, that blood will have a negative effect, that urea will have a negative effect on the muscles of the blood. So they will be weak and they will not be able to contract as they should. In people with lung disease, people who have lung disease may develop paralytic ileus, which may lead to intestinal obstruction, functional intestinal obstruction. Why and how? When someone has problems with their lungs, they will have a problem with taking in and out of gases. So meaning someone is likely to have low oxygen levels in the blood. And this means that there will be low oxygen reaching the muscles of the intestines. And when there is low oxygen levels reaching the muscles of the intestines, it means that these intestines will not be able to contract with full force. So you will find that in people with kidney disease and lung disease, there could be paralytic ileus, and this paralytic ileus can lead to intestinal obstruction. I hope that is clear. Now, let's move on to what we call mechanical intestinal obstruction. Now, in mechanical intestinal obstruction, there is actually something that is physically preventing the flow. So it could be that there is something inside, whichever it is, we'll discuss. That thing is physically preventing the flow of intestinal contents. Now, let me begin by saying there are different things that can cause mechanical obstruction. Number one, I will talk about what we call volvulus. Now, a volvulus is a twist of the intestine, in this case, since we are talking about intestinal obstruction. So the intestine can be twisted, as you can see in the diagram here. The intestine can be twisted, and when the intestine is twisted, that is what we call volvulus. So that means that there will be no flow of food, or there will be no flow of intestinal contents because of the twisting of the intestine. Another thing that can lead to mechanical intestinal obstruction is what we call intussusception or intersusception. Now, intersusception is simply the invagination of one portion of the intestine into itself. Okay, or the invagination of the intestine into itself. So intersusception is the invagination of the intestine in itself, as you can see in the diagram that is showing. Okay, so when there is an intersusception, then there will be a problem in the flow of contents, and that would lead to mechanical obstruction because of that physical blockage that you can see. Then we also have what we can refer to as adhesions. So adhesions can come after operation, where intestines actually stick to each other, and some tissue may be attached to a layer of the intestine. Now, what you need to understand is that these adhesions or these attachments are they are abnormal things, and because of adhesions, there could be compression of the intestines, and that would lead to an impediment in the flow of intestinal contents. The other things that can lead to intestinal obstruction mechanically are what we call tumors. When there is a tumor, within the lumen of the intestine, that tumor can prevent the flow of food, especially when we talk about, colorectal cancer. That will, prevent the flow of food. Some tumors can be outside the intestines, but as they begin to grow big, they'll be pressing on the intestines, and that will lead to intestinal obstruction.